Hello and welcome once again to Beatle University. I am Professor Moptop. And as we continue to learn about every single Beatles song of all, it's time to talk a bit more about George Harrison's guitar and jazzy horn-driven contribution to the White Album, all about Eric Clapton's love of chocolates.
Coconut fudge really blows down those blues. But you have to have them all pulled out after the Savoy Truffle.
Written in the midst of the White Album sessions, Savoy Truffle was all about Eric Clapton's poor dental work and his love for sweets. George listed the contents of the Macintosh chocolate Good News collection that he had when Eric came over for a visit, who apparently ate all of the chocolates. George also made up a few candy-sounding phrases to help finish the song, and they were all ready to record it as the band took a week away from EMI to record at London's Trident studio.
Cream tangerine, Montelimore.
On the 3rd of October, just a bit past the date that the album was supposed to be finished, George, Paul, and Ringo started work on Savoy Truffle, technically only recording one take, presumably carefully rehearsing the song during the 10-hour session before committing it to tape. George played guitar, Paul played bass, and Ringo played the drums. Not in attendance was John Lennon, who always seemed to be very uninterested in any of Harrison's compositions. We can assume that Yoko was also not around on this day. For the better part of the past 2 years, George had been a bit serious and his music had a very non-traditional sound to it. Savoy Truffle was a return to rock, less somber, not so heavy or thoughtful, and it emphasized something that George hadn't used too much in the previous couple of years, an electric guitar, or two. After spending October 3rd with George's latest, the following day they started Martha My Dear, then added saxophones and clarinets to Honey Pie.
I like that. Ooh.
Then a different set of session musicians came in for a string and trumpet overdub for Martha My Dear, which only started earlier in the same day. Then they got back to work on Savoy Truffle on the 5th, George singing his lead vocal with some artificial double tracking applied to it, a tool that the band hadn't used in a while.
Cream tangerine, Montelimore.
McCartney also added a few harmony vocals as well.
Yes, you have to have them all pulled out after the Savoy Truffle.
George Harrison wanted saxophones on Savoy Truffle, and George Martin assigned the task to Chris Thomas, who wrote a score for it and was ready for a group of session musicians to add 6 saxophones on the 11th of October, now back at EMI. In attendance again was Harry Klein, who played saxophone on Lady Madonna as well as on Honey Pie, now back for his 3rd session with the Beatles in 1968. After the 6 players played their brass section part, George asked engineer Ken Scott to distort the sound of it. Before the session guys came into the control room to hear the final product, George told them that I got to apologize for what I've done to your beautiful sound, going on to say please forgive me, but this is the way I want it. Although the hired musicians weren't too crazy about what George did to their recordings, they all knew that they were hired to do a job for a standard union fee, and after all, they did get to play on a Beatle record. On the 14th of October, the last day of sessions for the White Album, the finishing touches for Savoy Truffle were added, another electric guitar from George, and an electric piano from Chris Thomas, who had proven to be a very valuable asset to the Beatles during the 1968 sessions. Paul McCartney added a tambourine and some bongos onto the song, and somebody added an organ. John may have been present, although he did not contribute at all to George's ode to chocolate, continuing to remain uninterested in the track. Ringo was definitely not in attendance. On this final day of recording, he and his family left for a return visit to Sardinia, where he went when he temporarily quit the Beatles in August of '68. In the midst of tension and stress, the Beatles still managed to record a double album worth of material for the White Album, and while George did get 4 songs for the LP, that's still only 1 song per side, and of course he had a few leftovers as well. but he continued to shine brightly, displaying an extremely wide range of abilities as a songwriter, a guitarist, as well as an unofficial self-producer. After the band's breakup, George would get the opportunity to expand his great talents greatly once he was out from under the Lennon and McCartney umbrella. Beyond all this, George was still able to contribute some fantastic creations to the album, which took inspiration from such great things as George Orwell, Bob Dylan, the I Ching, and as we have now discussed, chocolate. And with that, we say so long for another week of Beatle learning. Join me back here next time when we learn some more about Beatles. Until next time, I am Professor Moptop.